Hey, extra historians, welcome to Lies, the portion of the show where we confess all the things we got wrong, tell you some stories we didn't get to fit in, which is a lot because we basically covered half the world in this series, and in general, just sort of take stock of the series. So today we're doing the Viking Expansion, which was a fun series. It was a technically pretty difficult series because we were doing a lot of places, and we had a lot of mispronunciations as a result of that. I'm just going to go through them really quickly. The worst one probably was Clontarf, the Battle of Clontarf in Ireland. I think we said Clontref. Armagh is the proper way to say it. I'm probably still not doing it. I'm very sorry, Irish fans. And lots of Scandinavian words. So, we don't really have a lot of time, and we have a lot of ground to cover, all the way from North America to Baghdad, so let's just dive in. For a recommended reading, if you want to get just like a fairly surface level idea of what happened, when, who did it, there's a pretty good popular fiction or popular history book called The Sea Wolves, A History of the Vikings by Lars Brownworth. It's going to give you kind of a blow-by-blow. It's very popular pop history, right? Like, it's not very crunchy and academic, but it's very exciting. It hits the highlights. You're not going to learn a whole lot about Scandinavian culture, but it'll give you the battles and the raids and things like that. If you want to get like a little more into detail, I'd go with The Vikings by Elsie Rosedal. It's a little more, it's not quite academic, but it's a little more academic. It's not quite as entertaining, though. There's also a really good version of the Vinland Sagas that's put out by Penguin. And I like to always give a couple of free resources, too. The podcast Norse by Northwest, I liked a lot when I came across it, because partially the guy who runs it has a very charming Scottish accent. And the other thing is he has a very cool way of kind of stopping in the middle and being like, all right, let's make sure we understand this one thing before we move on. And because we kind of had to skim over a lot, it's a good way, particularly in the Rus episodes, that if you wanted to dive in a little bit just in like an hour or two, that's a pretty good place to do it. Also, here on YouTube, Yale puts like full courses up, right? You can watch an entire course of lectures on the early Middle Ages over at Yale Open Course. Paul Friedman is the professor. It's very good. It's like being back in school if that's something you liked, which I do. All right, so let's talk about episode 1. First of all, thank you for the positive feedback on this one. I didn't really know how it was going to go. It's a little bit different than what we normally do, but one thing as I was planning the show is I was a little frustrated by the thought that we were going to talk about the Vikings like that's all that was going on in Scandinavia. I really wanted to put one episode aside to kind of like look at some people who are experiencing the Viking age but might not be going out and stabbing Anglo-Saxons to death, right? So they're taking advantage of what's being formed, but they're not violent participants in it. And overall, you seem to really like that. We did have a few things. A lot of them were like some visual things. One big one was mead. We probably should not have had them drinking mead. We probably should have had them drinking beer. Mead was generally a drink for the rich. They're traders, though, so maybe they came on a big cache of honey and just decided to blow it. We probably should have had more axes and fewer swords. Swords were, again, like an item mostly for the rich. This kind of did come across my desk when I was reviewing the episodes, but I was sort of like, well, you know what? I'll just talk about it in Lies. I don't have to go and like draw axes into everyone's hands retroactively. Many of you asked about population density in Scandinavia. So this is an interesting thing. Population density is one of the theories about why the Viking expansion happened. It's not necessarily the right one. It's probably a combination of factors. But many of you asked, like, how could Scandinavia, which is very large, be population dense in the Middle Ages? And basically, without technologies to improve land, and with a lot of arable land being along coastlines, it's not necessarily about there not being enough space, it's about the amount of cultivatable land and how much that land can produce. So that's how that theory goes. You know, believe it or not, that's essentially what it's arguing. We got a couple of shields inside out. That one's fun. During the review, I thought it was just a boss with a band over it, but actually it was the inside of the shield. We corrected it for the other stuff. Someone mentioned that there are boat-shaped graves in Sweden, but not in Norway. They're all over Scandinavia. They're just particularly large and prominent in Sweden, and the most famous ones are there. But from the research I did, and again, like, I am not final authority on any of this kind of thing, right? But apparently those stone ship burials do exist in other places in Scandinavia. Now, the big one. So we talked about Viking as a noun and Vikinger as someone who goes Viking. And we got some pushback here, including from some linguists, that Viking is not a verb. That Vikinger in Old Norse you add an R to masculine nouns in the nominative singular, and Vikinger is just the nominative singular of the Viking stem, not the derivative of a verb. Thank you to viewer copyright infringement, who's a linguist who pointed this out to us. Your name scared me a lot when I saw it in the comments, copyright infringement. And yes, thank you for that. I have seen this a bunch of different ways, so I'm not sure if this is one of those things is 100% settled. We'll get into this later. A lot of linguistic and naming things about the Viking Age people aren't necessarily sure about. But I would bet on you being right rather than me being right. Episode 2, Rollo the Walker. I didn't know before I started this job that I have a linguistic tick about the words ancestor and descendant. We said that William the Conqueror was the ancestor of Rollo. Obviously, that's not correct. He's the descendant. I just get them mixed up in my brain, apparently, because this is the second time it's happened that people have noticed. I also did it verbally in a lies episode, and we've retaped it. But yes, Rollo is the ancestor, unless, of course, Rollo the Walker is Rollo the Time Walker. Embarrassing nicknames for French kings. I was really excited that we were getting into the embarrassing nickname period of French history. I've kind of wanted to do a running gag about this ever since I came on as a writer. The sad part of these nicknames is probably none of them are contemporary. They really come in a couple hundred years after these guys are all dead to try and like tell them apart. A lot of them might have been ironic. Charles the Bald may have been particularly hairy, or he might have been the Bald because he was the only one who ended up coming to the throne without being landed first. So he was bald in that he didn't have lands, not he was bald. But, you know, this is not just a French monarchy thing, right? We talked about Michel the drunkard, who was, by the way, probably not a drunkard. That was probably a smear on him by later emperors. In the Muslim sources, he's actually a pretty competent guy. Also, Ragnar Lothbrok. Is he the guy that sacked Paris? Real answer? We don't know. It could have been another guy named Ragnar. The problem is, with a lot of the Viking Age, you're depending on people who are not the Vikings writing about the Vikings. They don't always understand what's going on. And we sort of have to piece together who's doing what and if these guys are the same guy. We'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about Ivar the Boneless in Ireland also. So no, we don't know if this was the same Ragnar as Ragnar Lothbrok, or if even Ragnar Lothbrok really existed, or if he was legendary or semi-legendary. This is just a tough thing about this period in time. Lots of folks didn't believe that the Queen of England is related to Rollo the Walker. She is if you also... Well, they didn't believe she was descended from him. She is descended from him if you're just talking about relations, like bloodline, right? If you follow the minor sons and daughters that were like shipped off to the continent and married to someone else, and then their lines end up marrying back into the family, and you follow the women particularly, yes, she's related to him. She is still related to William the Conqueror, who is the grandson of Rollo the Walker. It's just not a direct line, right? There's a lot of interruptions. Episode 3, Ireland. So we talked about how there were 2 High Kings of Ireland fighting. Really, there should only be 1 High King of Ireland. My understanding, which could be inaccurate, is that both of these kings were actually claiming the title at the same time. They were essentially fighting over it. I had not totally realized, and this is my fault, absolutely, because it should have occurred to me, that referring to the British Isles, including Ireland, even doing it geographically, is a very sensitive subject for the Irish. And I totally understand why. There is a long and painful history there. We're going to be doing the Irish potato famine, actually, not next series, but the one after. And we'll try and improve our Gaelic before then. But yeah, I will try not to do that in the future. It's kind of like a contentious thing because geographically you could make an argument, but the Irish government actually refers to them as these islands rather than the British Isles. And again, totally understandable why they would want to do that. Is the Ivar that we talk about in Dublin, Ivar the Boneless, the one that's famous for invading England with the Great Heathen Army? Maybe. The Annals of Ulster call him Ymir. That is generally interpreted as being a version of Ivar, but it's not a sure thing. It could be a different guy. I made him Ivar because basically I wanted to have Ivar in there. Between having him there and not having him there, I kind of wanted to put him in, because at some point I'm sure we're going to see him again, and I can always confess in lies. Episode 4, Lands of the Rus. We had some stuff in this one. Sorry. The biggest one, the really embarrassing one that I feel really bad about, is we said Cyrillic was a Byzantine writing system. It is absolutely not. What I had meant to say is that it's a Greek-influenced system. I was, in an earlier draft, trying to make this point about how people that aligned with the Greek church, right, the Byzantine church, tended to end up with writing systems that had Greek influence, whereas people who ended up Roman Catholic had like more Latin-influenced writing systems. But basically things got cut and slammed together, and it created a really bad error. So Cyrillic is not Byzantine. It is Glagolic, and it was developed in Bulgaria by students of a guy named Cyril and another guy named Methodius. It's called Cyrillic because they named it after Cyril. But yes, Bulgarian, Greek influenced, but Bulgarian made. Sorry about that. So the debate about who actually founded Kiev is a big deal. My understanding is that the Rus Vikings were always a very, very, very small part of the population, that they were a military elite, and there was always a very small number of them, and they basically immediately started marrying into Slavic, Baltic, Turkic families. And part of that is because that's what you do if you're a military elite and you're living amongst people where you are vastly outnumbered, is you start to take on their cultural practices and you start enlisting them as allies, right? And like we've seen in places like Normandy and Ireland, right, the Viking culture starts, like the Scandinavian culture, starts to disappear pretty quickly. They start to meld with local groups. But here's the thing. Kiev already existed when they founded Kiev. There was a settlement, right? And by the way, the Viking Kiev is actually not in the same place as modern Kiev. They're not too far apart, but they're not the same place. So there was a settlement that the Vikings then took over and massively expanded into a city. It's kind of the same thing with Dublin, right? There was already a system there, but it was nowhere near what the Vikings would turn it into. But again, there had to have been these local alliances that happened really early. We know that Scandinavian culture starts to disappear. By the time Russia's founded, literally there is nothing Viking left about the Rus, only the name that ends up, actually I think like practically not even the name, I think it was actually carried forward from the past. So yeah, really their only contribution to Russia is the name. But even that is still a hot topic. Go to the comments. I'm sure you will find other arguments. We had a big geographic mistake. We said Rurik went to modern-day Ukraine when he founded Kiev. We started talking about Novgorod immediately after. We didn't mention that he moved into what is modern-day Russia. Sorry, that was just my fault of explaining things while not looking at a map and not looking at a map of the Viking era world next to a map of the modern world. My fault entirely. And it's important to remember that we talk a lot about Slavic people in this episode. There's a whole bunch of different groups. We talk a little bit about it at one point in the episode, but we didn't re-emphasize it later. So between modern-day Russia and the Baltics is just really a whirlwind of different groups and people. Like we talked about Turkic nomads. Some of them were Jewish or practiced Judaism, which is fascinating. And, you know, we didn't really get into the Baltic peoples. We talked about the Finns, but not the Baltics. So sorry about that. We didn't mean to suggest that, you know, it's all one thing in Eastern Europe. Absolutely not true. Did the Rus Vikings mostly get chased off by Greek fire? I have a slightly alternate theory. I think Greek fire played a big part, but you start seeing longships disappear from Europe when other nations start building ships with raised decks, but particularly like large raised towers on the bow and stern of a ship. And because of that, you're able to fire down into the longships, and the longships have a really difficult time fighting and boarding these other ships. Interesting thing about Byzantine ships, they have a big raised second deck where they keep all the archers. So maybe that was something the Byzantines figured out before the rest of Europe. Something we didn't mention in these episodes is Olga is a saint, a terrifying saint. Seriously, go Google Saint Olga of Kiev, and yeah, just do it. I'll wait.
Okay, Zoe, let's see what we find here.
Terrifying, right? Like, look at those hooded eyes. She is so full of threat. I have never seen saint portraits that look more sinister. They kind of fit her. I sort of love her. Episode 5, Greenland. So there are a lot of alternate stories about how Greenland got named. One of them, my personal favorite alternate, is that when Iceland started getting overpopulated, again, see our description of Scandinavian overpopulation, it's not so much that there's not enough room, it's that there's not enough arable land. The Icelanders start saying, oh, hey, there's this great place over there called Greenland. You should totally not settle here. You should go to Greenland. It's way better. We cast a little bit of aspersions on Scandinavian navigational skills. The reason I said that is because we had really built up the maritime skills of medieval Scandinavians, and I wanted to puncture it a little bit. I thought actually in the first episode, maybe we even went a little bit overboard. And I just wanted to point out that, like, look, they had perfectly good navigational skills for what they needed to do, where they needed to do it, and the point in time when they lived. They got there, right? They got all the way to North America with the skills that they had. They had a difficult time reorienting themselves sometimes after they got blown off course. Not an unusual thing, but it was not, they didn't have bad navigational skills based on the area they were, what they needed to do, and the seas they were sailing in. However, I just want to point out, you know, they're not doing what the Austronesians, the Polynesians are doing around at the same time, where they're crossing, you know, thousands of miles of open water, finding tiny islands, and at one point establishing a trade between Hawaii and Tahiti, right? Their navigational skills could not have done that. But again, it didn't need to, because they're not in a place where they're having to cross that much ocean. Also, the Pacific is a lot easier to sail than the Viking territory. I'm just putting that out there. We talked about how Greenland was uninhabited. My understanding is that the Thule people who had become the Greenland Inuit either lived very far north in Greenland at that point, or lived in North America, hadn't come back over yet, or they had been in Greenland, but they went back over to North America. We'll talk about that a little bit later. We talked about one guy who got lost and sacked an Italian city thinking it was Rome. I just want to tell you this story because it's amazing. It's a guy named Haston. He and two other commanders end up going to the Mediterranean thinking this is like the greatest new front in the Viking expansion, right? First, they attack the Emirate of Cordoba. Doesn't go that great. The Muslims have Greek fire also. They have big walls. Yeah, not so great. They start sacking places in Italy. The other two decide to leave, and Haston decides that he really likes the idea of this city Rome that he's heard about. Sounds really rich. Sounds like the jewel of the Christian world. I think I'm going to go like take it over and take all their stuff. So he finds Rome. He gets out and he looks up at the walls and it's like, oh, this isn't a good idea. Like, these are the biggest walls I've ever seen. So they develop this plan. He pretends to be sick. They go up to the gate and essentially knock on it and say, hey, our captain is sick, our Jarl is sick, but he wants to convert to Christianity. Okay, so they baptize him. They come back the next day carrying Haston in a coffin and say our leader died and his last hope was to be buried as a Christian in the cathedral. So the poor bishop opens the gates, brings in the coffin, brings in 50 mourners in big long robes, and he's conducting a funeral service in the cathedral when Haston basically opens his coffin, jumps out with a sword, decapitates the poor bishop, and all the mourners throw off their cloaks and they have weapons and they sack the cathedral, they sack the city, and they take the bar because that's how you prove that you sacked a big city, because you have, hey, look at the size of this bar that was on the gate. The gate was really big. They throw it in their longships and they like run off talking about how great they are for sacking Rome. Turns out they got lost, sacked a relatively minor city called Luna, and I kind of think this story got passed on just because it's pretty funny. Like, I mean, it happened like 1,200 years ago, and that's why it's funny. But yeah, it's hilarious how they killed all those people in that city, especially the bishop who trusted them. Hilarious. All right. Episode 6. Unfortunately, so we're going to go to a 5-episode cycle with a one-off and then lies, beginning with our next series. And that's so that 6 can be out and you can comment on it and I can address your questions. Unfortunately, the schedule didn't let us do that this time. So I'm just kind of anticipating what you want me to talk about with Vinland. So we actually ended up naming this episode Wineland rather than Vinland, which is one of the two possible translations for Vinland or Vineland. The other one suggests that it refers to meadows rather than wine, which would make sense because the Viking settlement that we know today is in a very meadowy area. In fact, it's named after its meadows. I'm not going to pronounce the French because, again, I have too much respect for the French. I didn't intend for that to be the title of the episode, but basically the one time we had Vinland in text, we didn't explain what it was supposed to mean, so I had Nick replace it with Wineland, and that just sort of became the name of the episode as a result, and I liked it, and it was way better than the original episode title, which was Vinland. Who were the Native American First Nation tribe that the Vikings contacted? We don't know. Probably the most likely are the Thule, who are Proto-Inuit people, who are also the same ones who would move into Greenland and replace the Scandinavians after it got too cold and deadly and starving there for the Scandinavians. But yeah, the real answer is we don't really know. Probably the Thule. We went through a couple of different options for pronouncing Leif Erikson. So interestingly, there are many different ways to pronounce life in Scandinavia. Leif, Leif. One of them is not the American version, which is Leaf. Yeah, that is not a pronunciation in Scandinavia at all, which actually kind of surprised me. There were doubts about Freydis massacring the other settlement. I think that probably comes through with our caveat that this saga is generally just trying to make her look bad. But just in case we needed to say that outright, there have been people that argued that this never happened. Someone said that they were excited to hear me pronounce Newfoundland and get it wrong. We didn't use it in the episode, so there you go, Newfoundland. So, Walpole fact. How are we going to connect Walpole to the Viking Age? Pretty easily, basically in one step, his son. So, Horace Walpole is the son of Robert Walpole. He is well known for building a really weird house, inventing the Gothic novel, and being a member of Parliament. He also had this friend, Thomas Gray. They toured Europe together, they were at school together, and one of Gray's most famous poems is Ode on the Death of a Favorite Cat, Drowned in a Tub of Goldfishes, which was about Horace Walpole's cat who jumped up on a china vase that had goldfish inside and sort of fished around inside and fell inside and drowned and died. And then Thomas wrote this really funny poem about it because in the 18th century, people don't really think that animals are people. So you can say like, hey, I wrote this funny poem about your dead cat. And you'd be like, great, I'm Horace Walpole and I'm okay with this. But an interesting thing about Thomas Gray is he's part of this romantic movement that's starting to resurrect Old Norse poetry and translate it into English. And then use some of those elements in his English language poetry. Funny thing about this, though, is that Horace, who was his friend and was to a certain extent his patron, or at least his champion, was not a fan of this movement. He wrote a couple of letters that are basically making fun of Gray. And the first one, which is kind of my favorite, it's a little bit hard to directly quote, but he's essentially saying like, so Gray went back and he found some dude who was in Denmark in the Middle Ages who was exactly like Gray, and now he's translating all of his poetry. The second one, he's sort of making fun of the fact that anyone would be interested in what these savages, the Vikings, were thinking. Who can care what horrors a runic savage arrived at, all the joys and glories they could conceive, the supreme felicity of boozing ale out of the skull of an enemy in Odin's hall? Yeah, so, not a fan of the Vikings. However, 15 years after Gray's death, I think maybe he was feeling a little nostalgic because he has this new friend he's kind of patronizing. And his friend writes a poem that involves Scandinavian themes. And Horace Walpole's feeling is basically like, yeah, this is the best thing you've ever written. It's not as good as Gray's. All right, so we got some really cool stuff coming up on Extra History. We're just going to run through it a little bit. Next week, we're going to start Sun Yat-sen and the 1911 Revolution. I am really excited for this series. It's going to be state-sponsored assassinations and people living under false passports and bombings and army mutinies. Lots of fun. It's basically a spy series. And it's a guy who is not too familiar in the West, but you should know who he is because he's amazing. After that, we're doing the Irish potato famine. We're going to try and brush up our Gaelic before then. Sorry, Irish fans. And yeah, we've got some great stuff coming up in Extra Mythology too. Right now, we're running through the origins of the Japanese pantheon, Japanese creation stories, essentially. And we have a Christmas episode coming up that is written by me. And I'm very, very excited. And you get to just wait. You'll wait and find out what it is. It's Krampus. It's Krampus. We're gonna do Krampus. I couldn't hold it in. Sorry, James. It's Krampus.